Welcome, welcome. We're going to give folks just a few moments before we go ahead and get started. We're going to give folks just about another minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we proceed, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ruth, who's with the Community Language Co-op of Colorado to do our Spanish interpretation for today's event.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for having us here. My name is Ruth. Gracias a todos por tenernos aquí en este espacio. Mi nombre es Ruth, and I am with the CLC, and bear with me because I'll be interpreting for myself. But I want to thank ACLU Colorado for always prioritizing health equity through language justice as much as possible. We always want to make sure that everybody is able to speak, read, listen, and participate in the language of their hearts, meaning the language that they speak at home with their families. So once I finish the presentation, you guys will see that the interpretation will be turned on. At the bottom, you will see a globe icon. You can click on that and select the language that you would like to listen to. Also, you can say mute original audio so that way you don't have any noise in the background distracting you. And if you have any questions or problems, please let me know through the chat box or let us know. And again, thank you for having us here. Entonces, hola a todos, mi nombre es Ruth y estoy aquí con la Cooperativa Comunitaria del Lenguaje y gracias al ACLU Colorado por tenernos en este espacio y priorizar la equidad de salud a través de la justicia del lenguaje. Nosotros siempre queremos asegurarnos de que todos puedan hablar, leer, escuchar y participar en el idioma de sus corazones, es decir, en el idioma que hablan en casa con sus familias. Entonces, cuando termine esta presentación, van a ver en la parte baja que vamos a comenzar la interpretación. Ahí van a ver un globo, un icono de un globo terráqueo. Le pueden hacer clic, seleccionen su idioma. Pueden también decir cancelar audio original o mute original audio para que de esa manera no escuchen a nadie más que los intérpretes. Y si tienen alguna pregunta, como les dije, déjenos saber aquí por la cajita del chat y estamos siempre disponibles. Así que muchas gracias. Thank you, guys.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And I believe everyone should have the option at the bottom to pick the language of their choice. You will need to select a language in order to hear the correct audio. Um, let me make sure. Is everyone seeing that? Let's see. Okay, I just want to make sure folks are getting it. Okay, we got a few. All right, great, great. Okay, wonderful. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We're doing another part of our Bring Our Neighbors Home webinar series, and today's focus is on the destructive system of immigration detention. And we're going to provide you some solutions that are being proposed this legislative session to help keep our neighbors out of detention and united with their families as they should be. We have a great group of speakers today. We have, today with us, we have Romaine, so the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. We have CIRC, Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and then a few of our folks from the ACLU of Colorado to share with you some of the things that we're working collaboratively on this legislative session. So we're gonna go over our Bring Our Neighbors Home series and what that series is about and why we're focusing on detention and where immigration plays into that. And then we're going to go a little bit over the recent history of immigration detention. We're going to talk about our universal representation bill, which we're super excited about. We're going to talk about our data privacy bill, and we're going to talk about U visa and a jail depopulation bill. Finally, we're going to finish off with some calls to action and provide you with some ways that you can take this information and support the work that we're doing and be a part of it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and, and before I go on, I did want to mention that the ACLU of Colorado, as of yesterday, we have a new executive director. Her name is Deborah Richardson, and we are all very, very excited to have her starting with our organization. And she was going to join to say a few words, but it looks like she might be having some trouble logging on. So please stay tuned. We might have her joining us, but if not, we are doing a Meet the ED on March 10th at 12 p.m. where you can come and ask her all the questions that you have. So with that being said, I'm going to kick it off to Jessica Howard. She's our racial justice coordinator, and she is the expert of our Bring Our Neighbors Home webinar series. So yeah, thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Julian. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second part of our Bring Our Neighbors Home webinar series. So if you joined us 2 weeks ago, you learned a little bit about our campaign, which is this multi-year community-driven effort to end our state's over-reliance on detention to basically solve our social problems. So a major focus of the campaign is directed at the pretrial level of our criminal legal system to end wealth-based detention because so many of our neighbors are being caged while awaiting for trial, just for the simple fact that they are too poor to pay the money bond that they need for their release. But before we go into this webinar, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to discussing immigration detention in context of the campaign today. The issue of immigration detention and deportation is a civil matter. It's not part of the criminal system. And yet, immigration detention has a similar impact. The conditions of these facilities are inhumane and deplorable. Instead of remaining free to resolve their cases, our immigrant neighbors are being detained while facing the really very real prospect of losing their jobs, housing, and even custody of their children. In addition, if the person is a child or detained or even an asylum seeker, people in immigration don't have a right to access government provided counsel. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But if you are, like, again, a child detained or asylum seeker, meaning that people who even have a legal authority to be here get deported simply because they do not have the financial means to access an attorney. So again, drawing that link of wealth to determine your freedom. Detention and deportation are extremely harmful, not only to individuals and their families, but to the community at large. And that is why we are including a webinar about immigration policies in our series today, because again, it's about bringing our neighbors home from this overuse of putting people and locking them away. So with that, I'll hand it back to Julian to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jess. I'm going to introduce, if I can change the screen, Anna Tamu. She's our immigration campaign coordinator, and she's going to talk about a little bit about the history of mass immigration detention and deportation, and where we are right now with that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Temu. I am the immigration campaign coordinator, and today I really wanted to just go over some of the past 4 years. We know that since 2001, our federal government has been relying heavily on the Department of Homeland Security and using Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement to racially profile and terrorize communities. That has led to the mass deportation system we see today. And the history of this mass immigration deportation system is very vast and deserves its own webinar. So for the purposes of today, we're just going to be looking at some of the past 4 years and what those impacts are having today. We're going to go over some border apprehensions, ICE arrests, deportations, and some conditions at GEO. So we know that some of the most horrific pieces of policies regarding immigration came out these past 4 years, including the travel ban, rescinding of DACA, and separating over 5,000 children from their parents, and hundreds who have yet to be reunited. And we know that all of these adjustments to guidelines, adjustments to norms, are really going to have an impact on border apprehensions, on ICE arrests, and on deportations. So on border apprehensions, we saw through the caravan that the Trump administration used this as an excuse to declare a state of emergency, making far-reaching changes to asylum procedures to discourage folks from entering at the south border. And the remain in Mexico policy until your case is adjudicated or resolved also really deterred folks from really trying to enter the country. And so that now we're seeing this mass border apprehension, what we've been seeing for past several years. And then people are put into detention, into the detention system, and many times are left there for many times months and years until their cases are resolved. And so with ICE arrests, we're also seeing that during the Obama administration, ICE arrests did go down thanks to some of the grassroots work and a lot of local policies that were getting passed, and also the ending of a field program inside of a contract between local police and ICE. But we know that at the beginning of the Trump administration, ICE arrests started shooting up, and the need for know your rights trainings, the need for sanctuary style policies at the local level became more and more important. Especially here in Denver, there were several times where the Trump administration had selected a number of cities to really target and try to put as many ICE officers in our communities. And we know that Denver was one of those communities where they had targeted and really wanted to push raids. And so in our community, we have been pushing for know your rights trainings, whether it's at the community level. Remain also has an amazing know your rights training if folks end up at the GEO Detention Center. And we know that in fiscal year 2020, we had over 185,000 removals in that year. And I think this past year has really showed us that we can see these large numbers and really have to focus on not becoming numb to those large numbers. In fact, realizing and recognizing that those numbers, each one of those numbers represents a family, children, parents, siblings, spouses. And so looking at the 185,000 number, we really want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to keep our communities out of the deportation pipeline. Because we know that if folks end up at GEO, the conditions there are deplorable. We have seen so many cases of medical neglect, several cases of COVID, not even following standard social distancing practices inside of the detention center. And even here in Aurora at the GEO Detention Center, we have seen quarantines aren't anything new. Again, cases of medical neglect and even death. And so we did do a report called Cashing In on Cruelty that really highlights a lot of the instances of abuse and neglect inside of the GEO detention facility. If you do want to read more about some of those conditions in the detention facility, we do have that report for you. And so I just wanted to give an idea of folks of what it's like to be inside of the deportation pipeline, where you start at, what the conditions are in GEO. And so with that, we know that we need a lot of pieces of policy to help our communities, one, stay out of the deportation pipeline, but also if they do find themselves in there, that we have their backs, whether it's through legal representation, whether it's through activism, but that we are doing our part to help our neighbors and ensure that we can actually bring our neighbors back home. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Julian.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I think that one thing, and I was talking with Sienna, who's on this call the other day, is like, there's so many things in relation to immigration that's happening that we all feel almost overwhelmed because there's so much and we want to do it all. And it's just, this is a humanitarian crisis, what's happening to immigrants, especially in detention. And so it's really important to focus in on what can we do on the local level. And so we're going to transfer over now. We're going to talk about some of the policies that we're working on. And just keep in mind, like, these are policies that they're local, they're going to be statewide, and they do have a significant impact, especially as it relates to detention. So I'm going to pass it on over to Sarah Plastino. She's with the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. She is their senior staff attorney working in the detention program. We have been working with her on the campaign for universal representation, which she's going to talk to you all about. And we're really excited to have you here with us today, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Julian, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this webinar. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you and to also partner with you on the campaign for universal representation. And thank you to all of you who logged on today to learn a bit more about what you can do to end immigration detention and mass incarceration in this state and across the country. So as Anna and Jessica were saying, there's no right to appointed counsel in immigration proceedings. What that means is there's no public defender system. So the only way that you will be able to obtain an attorney is if you can afford to pay for one. And as we know, when a person is in immigration detention, they're unable to work, and therefore it makes it very, very difficult to hire an attorney unless you have savings or are, willing to go into a tremendous amount of debt, which many people are not able to do. So as a result, 70% of people who are in immigration detention here in Colorado appear before the immigration judge without an attorney. And that's a really staggering number if you think about that from a due process perspective and from an equity perspective. The vast majority of people have to face the judge alone, while in a detention facility that was built as a prison while separated from their families, while not having access to information or resources, and while bearing the psychological impact of being in a jail-like facility. So just to orient you a bit more to immigration detention in the state. So there are 2 immigration courts in Colorado, and this is where the US Department of Homeland Security seeks to deport people. There's one in Denver and there's one in Aurora inside the ICE detention facility that's located there. And there are space for 1,500 people at that detention facility on any given day. Across the country, in the height of the Trump administration, on any given day, there were upwards of 70,000 people per day in immigration detention across the country. And the facility in Aurora is one of these mega detention centers where ICE holds thousands of people at a time. So the campaign for universal representation is a campaign to create basically a public defender system for appointed counsel for immigrants in removal proceedings in the state of Colorado. So this campaign is part of a national movement to create systems of appointed counsel for immigrants in immigration proceedings. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but it's exciting for you to understand that this is part of a much larger movement. It's not just our local movement. We are connected with organizers nationally as well. So how will increasing representation in immigration proceedings lead to a decrease in immigration detention? Well, in order for you to understand that, you have to understand how someone can be released from immigration detention. So it's very difficult to be released from immigration detention. Oftentimes people will be released on a criminal bond if they're arrested, but then not actually released from on an immigration bond. So it's actually even harder to get out of immigration detention than it is generally when a person is accused of a crime. So there are a few different ways to be released from immigration detention, but all of them are very onerous. One common way is to be released on bond, but that is an appearance before a judge in an adversarial proceeding, which means that there's a prosecutor advocating for the continued detention of a person, and the immigrant themselves has to prove that they are not a flight risk and they are not a danger. They need to collect evidence, they need to make legal arguments, they need to present testimony, witnesses. And as you can imagine, doing this alone without a lawyer up against a trained government prosecutor, it's no wonder that people with attorneys are much more likely to obtain bonds and much more likely to obtain a low bond. Bond amounts can be astronomically high in immigration detention. And the amount of the bond is also determined by the evidence submitted. So if you don't have an attorney and you have less ability to collect evidence, it's more likely that your bond amount will be higher and that you won't be able to pay your bond amount to secure your release. Even if you win a bond, the ICE prosecutor can appeal that bond and it can be taken away by an appellate court. There are other ways to obtain release, but they're similarly complicated. You can ask your deportation officer to release you voluntarily. You can imagine how frequently that happens, not very frequently. And even that request requires lots of very detailed evidentiary submissions. Or there's another way, but it requires a filing in the federal district court. And imagine how difficult that would be from immigration detention without a lawyer. So it's very difficult to obtain release if you don't have an attorney advocating for you and pursuing the various options simultaneously. So with an attorney, the likelihood of release is increased and also the duration of detention is decreased. And then after someone is released, having an attorney also decreases the likelihood of redetention. So if someone is released on an immigration bond, they can be redetained if they violate the terms of their bond, whether that's by being arrested or by missing a hearing. And so having an attorney helps people navigate the system and assure that they don't make a logistical mistake and accidentally miss their hearing, resulting in a deportation order. So having that support throughout the duration of the case dramatically reduces the restrictions on a person's liberty. So you can go into the next slide, please. So to address this really fundamental structural problem in immigration proceedings, the immigration advocacy community in the state has been campaigning for the creation of a statewide universal representation program, a legal defense fund for immigrants in removal proceedings. So this is a coalition of, this is a campaign of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition with many different organizations who are members of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition participating in the steering committee, including RMIAN, the ACLU, and many other organizations from across the state, AFSC, Mountain Dreamers, folks from all over in rural areas as well. So this is truly a statewide people power effort, and it has been informed by the priorities of impacted community members. So this campaign is in its second year, and this year and last year, the members of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition chose this campaign to be the #1 priority. And so that was through a vote through a statewide assembly of impacted people and members. So that is very exciting. And the entire time it has been influenced by the identified needs of the community. You can go to the next slide, please. Great. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to pass a statewide bill that creates a fund for representation for immigrants in the state. If we do this, we will be the first state in the nation to pass legislation to create such a program, which is very exciting. There are other states that have created statewide programs through other means, but we would be the first one to create it through legislation. And as I mentioned before, this is part of a national movement. The national movement is in recognition of the grave due process concerns raised by a lack of counsel in immigration proceedings, especially in the detention context. It's motivated by the racial inequities in the immigration system, the disproportionate impact of immigration enforcement and detention on Black immigrants specifically. And so in that respect, it is a campaign for racial justice and equity as much as it is a campaign for due process. So what would this bill provide? Well, it would create a fund where anyone who is in immigration proceedings and is 200% or below the poverty line in the state would be eligible for an attorney, just like you would be eligible for a public defender if you're appearing in criminal court and unable to afford a lawyer in that context. So there are no other requirements. You don't have to be eligible for a defense. You don't have to have a certain criminal record. It is purely universal. If you can't afford an attorney and you're appearing before the court, you would qualify under the program. In addition, you have representation in all of the matters that you need representation in. So this is something that non-lawyers might not immediately think about, but when you're appearing before a court, sometimes if you're paying an attorney, oftentimes you can only afford to have representation on maybe your bond or maybe your deportation hearings, all different applications that you might be eligible for. And in this program, the attorney would represent the client in all of the matters, making sure that they have the defense that they need in all aspects of their case. The grants would go to qualified nonprofits who are already doing this work and have a demonstrated track record of quality representation. The majority of the funds would be diverted to detention representation, so representation in the detained context, in recognition of the liberty interests involved and the heightened dangers to people when they are in immigration detention and the additional barriers to self-representation or affording private counsel in that context. In addition, there is a focus on creating representation in other parts of the state outside of the Front Range and outside of the Denver metro area. So a portion of the funds would be earmarked as well to create additional legal service providers throughout the state so that people who are located in more rural areas can have access to an attorney in person near their home. And so a portion of the funds will be going to people who are not in detention, who are still in immigration removal proceedings, which is also important even for people who were formerly in detention, because once you're released from detention, your immigration case continues and you have to appear at hearings before the Denver Immigration Court. Next slide, please. So here are our fantastic, amazing sponsors in the Colorado Assembly. In the House, it's Representative Tipper and Representative Ricks, and in the Senate, it's Senator Moreno. And we are very proud that our bill is going to be introduced very soon, potentially even as soon as today. So we are thrilled about that, and we are very hopeful that it will pass through and create the fund. Our goal is at a minimum to create the fund, but we're also hoping to attach some funding to it so that we can at least start the program with, at a minimum, some limited funding. And best case scenario, if the bill passes, the funding could begin as soon as January of 2022, which is very exciting. But for all of that to happen, we need your support. And so we're going to drop a link in the chat now where you can sign up to be kept informed about the campaign and what you can do to support us. So thanks so much for your attention, and we hope that you will support the statewide Legal Defense Fund campaign.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I always learn so much from you. And so now we're going to talk about data privacy. So with the universal representation, that's a way for us to help those who are dealing with immigration court and make sure that they're getting the proper representation that every person should get. Now, data privacy, it's going to focus more on how are we avoiding people being put in that position in the first place. So with that, I'm going to introduce Sienna Mann. She's with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and she's a campaign manager. And so, yeah, really excited to have Sienna here with us today to share with you all of the great work that she's been doing on data privacy.
Thank you so much, Julian, and thank you all for being here today. So to start talking about why we need the data privacy campaign, I want to take us back to talking about the SB 251 driver's license program, because it's actually the root of the immigrant community's work in Colorado that led us to recognizing the need to address data privacy as an issue. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. What is SB 251? What are SB 251 driver's licenses? So in 2013, the Colorado State Legislature passed SB 251, which allowed DMV offices certain DMV offices, not all of them, to offer driver's licenses to undocumented residents in Colorado. And this campaign this law passed in 2013 after many, many years of organizing from directly impacted community members that fought to return driver's license access to Colorado after it was originally removed in 1998. So in order to obtain an SB 251 license, it's not as easy as it was for me as a US citizen. Residents of Colorado obtaining SB 251 licenses have to provide really extensive documentation showing that they've lived in Colorado for 2 years at least, showing their passport or consular ID, as well as a taxpayer number, like an ITIN number or a social security number. And since we implemented this program in 2014, actually just over 150,000 immigrants in Colorado have accessed these licenses. Next slide. And as part of this implementation program, CIRC, along with a coalition of other organizations, created a coalition called I Drive Colorado, or in Spanish, Yo Manejo Colorado. And I Drive is a coalition of organizations around the state, and we work on implementing the program and improving it. So we've passed several improvements to the bill over the years to make the program more accessible. We have community groups around the state that help people collect the documentation and understand how to go through the arduous process of accessing a driver's license, which, as you can imagine, is so important for our everyday activities. It is the single most important document I use on a daily basis to drive to work, to identify myself to law enforcement, right? Next slide. And Over the years, we have heard concerns from community members that ICE accessed their driver information. And this move represents a larger trend around ICE enforcement, which has increasingly relied on surveillance tactics, on the collection and gathering of data on immigrant community members to do immigration enforcement. And of course, surveillance tactics are weaponized not only against immigrant communities, but communities of color largely. But of course, in this case, we're talking specifically about the collection of data for immigration enforcement purposes. We at CIRC and with the iDrive Coalition decided to investigate. We wanted to get to the bottom of the problem, and we wanted to understand whether community members were being put at risk by accessing a driver's license, which is a service provided by the state. So we submitted an Open Records Act request, and we received records showing that there was communication between DMV employees and ICE agents for the purpose of immigration enforcement. Our records only show this communication between January 2018 and May 2020. So we don't know exactly when communication started. We can imagine that it may have been happening for years before our records indicate. But I will show you an example of the kinds of communication that we saw. So if you could go to the next slide. So in this correspondence, you see a DMV employee providing contact information to an ICE agent, quote unquote, just in case you need it. And this is somebody who had a visa overstay. So it's somebody who came into the US with a visa, overstayed their visa, so now no longer have a lawful immigration status, and applied for an SB 251 license. Of course, this program is designed for people who don't have a lawful immigration status to apply for an access to driver's license. And so in this case, we saw somebody's status being weaponized against them and their information, personal information, being shared for the sole purpose of immigration enforcement. This was just one example of many, but of course, finding this out was incredibly damaging for our committee, for our community, for our organizations that have been encouraging community to come forward to access this program for many, many years. Next slide. We brought these concerns to Governor Polis, and he passed guidance on data privacy in May 2020. And the guidance has been largely effective. It has prohibited state agencies from sharing information without a warrant, order, or subpoena, or without evidence of a criminal investigation or possible crime in progress. So, you know, if an ICE agent is trying to get information on someone, they need to have evidence of a criminal investigation. And it requires agencies to report the requests they receive from ICE to the governor's office on a quarterly basis. This has allowed us to better track and understand the kinds of the ways that ICE has been accessing information from our state government. Next slide. However, the governor's guidance is not permanent. And there are some loopholes in the governor's guidance that ICE can continue to take advantage of. And that's why we are fighting this year to make this permanent in law. We firmly believe that people should be encouraged to come forward and access benefits from the state that they're eligible for, like a driver's license, right? And that nobody should have fear that that information that they provide to the state to access these benefits could be used against them. Communities have been facing trauma under years of the Trump administration. We want to try to rebuild that trust with our state government. And so we are so grateful that champions Senator Julie Gonzalez and Representative Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez are leading the fight on this bill. And basically what this bill does is it strengthens the protections that were already in the governor's guidance and makes them permanent in law. And like I said, we're really hoping that this can help restore the trust with the government so that no one has to fear that by accessing a driver's license or another state service like contact tracing, that that could lead to the separation of their family. So I'm going to go through the actual bill details here briefly so that everyone gets a sense for what's in there. So the bill requires a judicial warrant, court order, or subpoena in order to release personal identifying information to a third party. This strengthens upon the governor's guidance, and the governor's guidance allowed a couple loopholes around a possible crime in progress. We want to make sure that there's a legitimate crime that's being investigated before allowing a third party to access personal information on anyone. We also want to make sure that our state databases are secure. So that all third parties, so anybody who's not state law enforcement or anybody who's not part of the state has to confirm that they won't use the records or information for civil immigration purposes, and also that they won't share it with others for civil immigration purposes. We also want to reduce the personal information that's collected by state agencies from the get-go. The best way we can protect people's information is making sure that the state does not have it in the first place. And so going forward, we want to make sure that the state isn't collecting additional information other than what they need to administer their programs. And that includes immigration status, place of birth, nationality, things like that. And finally, we are hoping to codify the governor's reporting structure into law by making sure that any requests that are made or granted are recorded and reported to the governor's office and the legislature so that we can track trends and see any discrepancies and make sure that it's being implemented effectively. The final piece is that we are hoping to put in place accountability measures for state employees that are involved in intentional data privacy breaches. Next slide. And similar to what Sarah said, we would love your support to move this campaign forward. In addition to the Legal Defense Fund, this was one of the priorities chosen by our membership at CIRC that represents organizations from around the state, including the ACLU. And so we are really recognize that that this campaign is urgent for immigrant communities. So yeah, we would love to have your organization endorse our campaign. If you're a part of an organization or as an individual, you can also let your representatives know that you care about this issue. And if you sign up on that link, you will be contacted for future action alerts when we're calling to let our representatives and state senators know that we support it. And you can also share messages of support on social media, on Twitter, but we would love to have your support and hope we can continue to activate you to be involved in the campaign as we move it forward this year. And I will just note, I think Denise may talk about this later, but we did, the bill was introduced last week, and the official number is Senate Bill 2021-131. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sienna, and congrats on the bill being introduced. We're really excited about this one. And like she said, Denise is going to talk in a moment about some of the updates. So what are some other bills, what are some other things that immigrants are facing that tie into the bigger picture of these violations that immigrants face? So we have U visa and then jail depopulation. And jail depopulation is a big bill that we're focused on this year. And Denise is going to talk a little bit more about that and how it, ties indirectly to immigrants. But with that, I'm going to introduce Denise Myers, our wonderful public policy director at the ACLU of Colorado. And she's also going to talk about where we're at with some of these bills that we're working on. So with that, welcome, Denise.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you to the others that have presented. I think we have a good, robust, if I may say, legislative package that will address some of our immigration-related issues and concerns. I want to go back to some of the comments that Anna made early on, and that is really what has happened over the last 4 years. There is no question that the prior occupant of the White House had one, I would say, an immigration policy that can be defined by one term, and that is cruel. And although the legislative package that we are offering here in the state of Colorado won't cure all of those ills, we do hope that it will take us an inch closer to making Colorado a welcoming place for all of its residents. No one need live in the shadows, and we all hope that we can all be one and contribute to our community. I want to tell you a little about the U visa bill, which has actually been introduced. The bill sponsors on this are Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez. Interesting that you've heard her name quite a bit already. And also a new representative out of Aurora, Ivan Joda. Let me just give some background on what the U visa is. A U visa is in federal immigration law, and it permits someone who is a witness to a crime, to the extent that they are helpful in solving the crime, so they are working with law enforcement to solve this crime, they can apply for a U visa, and that U visa is given by the federal government, and then they would be permitted to stay lawfully in this country. So what has happened across the state of Colorado is law enforcement has to provide a certification that says, hey, you are being helpful, you are a witness to a crime, and here is your certification. Well, what we have found throughout the state of Colorado is if you are in an immigrant-friendly community, those certifications are signed pretty easily, not with a whole lot of time taken to sign them. But if you are in a less friendly, immigrant-friendly community, that may not be the case. So what this bill intends to do is just make it uniform across the state that law enforcement can only look at whether you are helpful in solving a crime or you are a victim to a crime. And they have to sign that certification within 90 days. And so that's all this legislation does. And I say that's all, but it's actually pretty significant because that gives a lot of comfort to individuals who are victims or witnesses to a crime that they will get their certification in a timely manner, present it to federal immigration authorities, and be one step closer to receiving a U visa. We want to thank the representatives for bringing this bill forward. It actually did get out of the House last session on a bipartisan fashion, but got killed in the COVID environment. We can go to the next slide. I'm not going to get into the weeds very much of our jail depopulation bill, but here's why I think it's really important as an immigration-related issue. What this bill does, frankly, pure and simple, is it keeps fewer people out of jail. There will be a presumptive summons in lieu of arrest. In other words, you'll get a citation or a notice of when you have to go appear in court for your alleged offense instead of being arrested and taken into jail. There also is a provision in this bill that would say you automatically get a personal recognizance bond instead of paying money bond. The reason, the connection or the nexus and relevance to our immigrant community is it basically means that fewer people are in the net of law enforcement, and that means there are fewer people that the sheriff's office can tattle on and say, these individuals are here, hey ICE, you may want to come get them. So fewer people in the pipeline, fewer people in the net means fewer people that law enforcement can tattle on and turn over to immigration officials. As I think it's already been reported about the status of these bills, the jail depopulation bill will actually be in Senate Judiciary on Thursday at 1:30, that's day after tomorrow. It is being brought forward by Senator Lee in the Senate and Representative Adrian Benavides in the House. And then the U visa bill, and I am so sorry that I am blanking out the bill number. I always commit those to memory. But that will actually be in House Judiciary on Tuesday. We have a great lineup of witnesses, but can certainly always use more. We are very, we at the ACLU are proud, delighted, and happy to work with CIRC, with Forward, with others on the Legal Defense Fund bill, the Data Privacy bill, and collectively they send a message to not only our elected officials, but maybe to other states and to the people of Colorado that home is here. And we ask for your support for this package of legislation. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Julian.
Thank you so much, Denise. And well put for how all of those bills tie into immigration and how important they are this year. So now we're going to talk a little bit about calls to action, and Anna's going to go ahead and talk to you about how you can help support all of this work that we are doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian. We're going to drop several links in the chat. We want to make sure that we are providing as much support for you as possible. And so we do have a survey of what you want to get involved in, if it's immigration, if it's reproductive health and justice. You know, we want to make sure that we bring you all the information that you want to know about. And so we have a survey. If you want to stay involved, please fill that out. Let us know what you want to get involved with. One of the things that we are looking for partners on or volunteers on is one of our partners, COPA, the Colorado People's Alliance, is starting out a detention hotline for folks that have families in detention, you know, people that need some resources. So we are looking for volunteers to help out one of our partners. If you are interested in helping out in some of this detention work, the COPA Detention Hotline is going to be a really great place to plug in. So once you're going into our survey, if you want to stay involved in immigration, please list it on there. And if you want to specifically help out with this COPA Detention Hotline, please make sure that you type that in as well into the survey. As part of the our webinar series, we did have a legislative advocacy training not long ago, and we do have that recording that kind of just goes through how a bill becomes a law, the process, the different systems of government, and how you can get plugged in. So we do have that recording if you would like to learn a little bit more, you know, kind of get yourself situated, make yourself a good educational foundation of getting involved. And we do have a couple of story of self trainings coming up. We really want to make sure that our members are able to go to the Capitol and testify. We want to make sure that the story that you are telling is the most powerful, the most impactful, and that it's going to get that representative or senator to vote the way that you want them to vote. And so we have a story of self-training coming up Tuesday, March 23rd, in the middle of the day at lunchtime, and then Thursday, March 25th at 4 p.m. We are going to be teaching you how to build your story, what questions to ask yourself. And so this is going to be a really, really great tool if you want to advocate on any of the bills that you just heard here today. This is going to be a really great tool for you to learn. And so we really want to make sure that folks are able to come. And then we do have some upcoming webinars as part of the Bring Our Neighbors Home series. If Jules, you could go over to the next slide, please. Awesome. So again, like we mentioned earlier, we are welcoming a new executive director, and we are having a meet our new executive director on March 10th at noon. So we really hope you're able to join us for that. And then I will pass it over to Jess to talk about our webinars with juvenile decarceration and reproductive fundamental bill of rights.
Thank you so much. So yes, our Bring Our Neighbors Home webinar series is continuing on. In 2 weeks, we will be bringing on our good policy folks to talk a bit about juvenile decarceration and how you can get involved with that in terms of how you know, the system impacts our kids too. And we really need to have that conversation and make sure that that is part of our conversation for this legislative session. And then on March 30th, we'll talk about the Reproductive Fundamental Bill of Rights, where there is a section in the bill that does impact folks who are receiving reproductive health care in our jails. And so you can get a little information about that. And so we're really excited to continue this series on, because at the end of the day, again, it's about bringing our family members, our friends, our neighbors home. They don't and should not have to languish again in these inhumane facilities. Thank you. And I will drop the chat I will drop the link for both of these webinars to participate in.
Awesome. Thank you so much all. And there was a couple questions in the chat as you, Sarah and Sienna were going through their content. So Sarah, do you have a moment to answer a couple questions about the universal representation? Okay, yeah. So one question was, how is a Coloradan defined? How is it different, like someone who just arrives and is seeking asylum?
So currently the draft bill includes anyone who is detained in the facility for long enough to establish Colorado residency under law. So even if an asylum seeker presented themselves at the border, was detained, transported to Colorado to the facility in Aurora, they would qualify under the bill because they are currently residing in the state of Colorado.
Wonderful, thanks. And how would a legal defense fund in Colorado, the statewide fund, differ from the Denver Immigrant Legal Services Fund?
Yeah, so the Denver Fund is exclusively for residents of the city and county of Denver. And that's an amazing groundbreaking program that proved that a model like this can work in the state. So the Legal Defense Fund is a statewide campaign to expand eligibility beyond residents of the city and county of Denver. And it's also important to note that while the U.S. Citizenship Act, which is the legislation that was introduced in Congress under the Biden administration, does provide for appointed counsel in some limited circumstances, it's not universal appointed counsel. So this is the first draft of the bill, and it only provides for appointed counsel for children and especially vulnerable groups, which isn't defined. So, you know, it's likely to be watered down through negotiations, et cetera, if it passes at all. Therefore, it will not be providing universal representation. So even if that is passed, there will still be a great need here in Colorado for additional resources for appointed counsel.
And there's different efforts across Colorado to pass these, you know, some form of universal or some form of legal defense services. And so the statewide is going to be one that we know will affect all people across Colorado, and not just in these like more progressive bubbles like Denver and Boulder and Aurora and places like that, which we have efforts in all of those counties. But yeah, so like Sarah said, it's going to be more on a statewide level. And for Sienna, what does it mean that ICE accessed driver information? Isn't that the same thing LEOs do during a traffic stop?
Yeah, the difference here is that during a traffic stop, information is being accessed by law enforcement for a traffic purpose. And so we're absolutely not, the bill does not impact the ability for law enforcement officers to access DMV information. In fact, it has, our DMV information is used for law enforcement. It has a lot of different purposes in the state, and the bill ensures that we don't get in the way of state agency functions, including law enforcement functions. We're basically trying to ensure that it can't be used for immigration enforcement. So the information that somebody gives to the state to access a driver's license or any other state benefit can't be used for the express purpose of finding that person and separating them from their family. And I think it is important to note that those practices are not currently illegal under law, but we believe that our state will be safer if everyone feels comfortable accessing these kinds of services. And so the governor's guidance set some guidelines, but we want to make it permanent so that it is not permitted for state employees to be involved in those practices in the future. I hope that answered your question.
And then we have one Q&A in the chat. And if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A function. And I'll open this up to the group. Are immigrants getting vaccinations both in and out of detention?
I can speak to the detention aspect.
Yeah.
No, we have not heard any reports that anyone who is currently detained in the Aurora facility has been vaccinated, despite that there are very large and ongoing outbreaks at the facility. And, the ostensible purpose of detaining someone in the first place is so that they can attend court. But what we're seeing is that very frequently people are unable to attend their courts because of coronavirus quarantines. I have one client who has been rescheduled 7 times. So no, which is a very upsetting issue, and we hope that will change.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
And for the vaccination piece, so everybody's eligible for a vaccine in Colorado. There's no ID requirement. And so for anybody, of course, notwithstanding those in detention, everybody should be able to access a vaccine as long as you meet the eligibility requirements set by the state. So there are no ID requirements. There are no lawful presence requirements to access a vaccine. And we absolutely encourage anybody, regardless of your immigration status, to come forward.
Thank you, ladies. And I will add, the ACLU, we're doing, part of our decarceration work is some advocacy to make sure that those who are in detention are vaccinated. So we've been launching some letters and some calls to action. So keep an eye out for those. They're kind of on hold at the moment, but we expect to continue that advocacy because, like Sienna mentioned, and Sarah mentioned, people in detention, they're way more likely to get the virus because they have no ability to social distance. So it doesn't make sense for us to not prioritize them for vaccinations. Any other questions for today for our great group of panelists? Okay, we have one more question, and I'll open it up to the group. Have you seen any more releases or changes in priorities at the detention center since the new administration came in, or is everything still the same?
Hi, Laura. Thank you for that question. Currently, we have not seen any change, but we believe that is because the various DHS sub-agencies are waiting for additional guidance on how to implement the new guidelines. So we are very hopeful that within a few weeks, there will be some positive change, and we are gearing up to submit requests for all of our clients who might qualify for exercises of prosecutorial discretion. So stay tuned.
That's great. I think that's something that's on a lot of our minds and we're all wondering. Great. Well, if there's no other questions, I just want to thank our panelists and thank Ruth with the Community Language Co-op for being here. This was a great, very informative webinar, and I'm really excited to share all the information with you all. I will send it out I'll send out the recording, I'll send out the links, and any information that might be helpful for you. after this webinar. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Pleasure to present with you all.
Thank you.